If you, like, toss salt directly onto yeast in a mixing bowl, you aren't just making, a minor procedural error. You are literally initiating a localized, microscopic mass casualty event.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Right, because the osmotic pressure just rips the moisture right out of the yeast cell walls. It effectively neutralizes your leavener before the dough is even fully mixed. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at the TESDA Bread and Pastry NC2 certification.
Which is, it's intense.
It really is. It's this rigorous assessment manual from the Philippines that separates, casual home cooks from certified professional culinary experts.
And it completely strips away all that romanticism we normally associate with the kitchen. Like the certification standards, they really don't care about your intuition or how your grandmother used to bake.
Yeah, no grandma's secret recipes here.
Exactly. They look at the bakery as a highly controlled laboratory environment. When you actually read through the assessment criteria, it becomes super clear that passing requires like a deep fluency in applied chemistry, thermodynamics, and, well, cellular biology.
Which is wild to think about for baking.
It is. You're constantly balancing these variables that can instantly ruin a product if they, drift by even a few degrees or just a couple of grams.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to fully grasp the stakes of these assessments, we really have to drop down to the molecular level, like take flour.
Right. The most basic ingredient.
Exactly. We usually treat it as just this static ingredient, right? Just bulk matter in a bag.
Yeah.
But the assessment treats it as a volatile matrix. It focuses heavily on two very specific proteins, glutenin and gliadin.
Which, when they're dry, they're completely inert. They don't do anything.
Right. But the moment you introduce hydration, water, and kinetic energy, which is, the actual physical friction of mixing, you force those proteins to cross-link.
And that cross-linking forms the viscoelastic network we call gluten. And that term, viscoelastic, is super critical here.
It's not just a generic web, right?
No, not at all. The gliadin proteins provide the viscosity, meaning the dough can stretch and kind of flow without snapping. And then the glutenin provides the elasticity, giving it the structural memory to snap back into shape.
So as you mix, you're literally aligning these protein polymers into organized overlapping sheets. It's almost less like mixing a batter and more like you're weaving a bouncy castle on a microscopic scale.
A bouncy castle, yeah, I like that. Or like a biological polymer net.
Right, and that net has a really specific mechanical purpose. It has to possess enough tensile strength to trap all the carbon dioxide gas bubbles that are being burped out by the yeast during fermentation.
Which brings us back to that lethal interaction with salt you mentioned at the start.
The mass casualty event.
Exactly. Yeast is a living organism, right? It's these single-celled fungus undergoing anaerobic respiration, so it's metabolizing ambient sugars and releasing carbon dioxide and ethanol.
But keeping that biological engine running requires incredibly precise parameters. Like, the ideal thermal window for yeast activation is strictly between 24 and 27 degrees Celsius.
It's a very, very narrow warm bath.
Yeah, and the thermal ceiling is absolute. Once the internal temperature of that dough hits 33 degrees Celsius, the proteins within the yeast begin to denature.
The cellular machinery just completely breaks down.
Right, the organism dies, and fermentation permanently ceases. Game over.
It's an irreversible structural collapse at that point. And, temperature is just one variable. The osmotic threat of salt is equally terrifying for the yeast.
Because salt is hygroscopic, right?
Yes, intensely so. It actively seeks out and bonds with water molecules. So in a dough matrix, if the local concentration of salt is too high right next to the yeast, the osmotic pressure goes way out of balance.
The water just rushes out.
Exactly. Water will rapidly migrate out of the yeast cells through their semi-permeable membranes just to dilute the surrounding salt. It's a process called plasmolysis. It basically dehydrates and murders the yeast on the spot.
Okay, wait. If salt is a lethal weapon to yeast, how do bakers ever make salty breads like pain de sal without ending up with flat breaks? Because, practically speaking, salt is essential. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just for flavor, but doesn't it actually interact with the gluten to strengthen the dough?
Yeah, the sodium and chloride ions tighten those polymer chains. You need it. So what's fascinating here is how professionals bypass this biological conflict. It requires strategic staging.
Like procedural workarounds.
Right. The certification demands specific sequencing. A professional will often homogenize the salt into the dry flour mass first. So they are completely coating the salt crystals in starch and protein.
Oh, so it creates a buffer.
Exactly, a physical and chemical buffer. So by the time the hydrated yeast is introduced into the bowl, the osmotic draw of the salt is diluted across the entire flour matrix.
That lowers the localized pressure
Yeah.
and protects the yeast to cell walls. That makes perfect sense. The flour acts as like a dispersal mechanism.
It's all about controlling the environment.
Right. So, assuming we navigate the biological hazards, we've kept the yeast alive, we're actively weaving those viscoelastic sheets. We then have to physically measure the integrity of that structure.
Moving from the microscopic to the hands-on architectural methods.
Yeah. And the manual outlines some pretty rigorous tactile diagnostics for this, the most famous one being the window pane test.
Ah, the ultimate test for bread dough.
Yeah, it measures the rheology of the dough, right?
Mhm.
It proves those bouncy castle protein polymers have aligned properly.
Exactly. If you take a cross-section of the dough and stretch it out, a fully developed gluten network will form a membrane so thin and organized that it becomes visually translucent.
Like a window pane.
Right. You can pull it taut enough to actually see light passing through the sheets without the structural bonds shearing.
But if the membrane tears prematurely, it means the disulfide bonds between the proteins haven't fully formed yet. The tensile strength just isn't there.
It needs more physical agitation.
Yeah. And then there's the diagnostic for fermentation, which is the poke test. That measures the tension equilibrium right before baking.
So when you indent proofed dough, just poking it about a centimeter deep, you're testing the balance between the internal gas pressure generated by the yeast and the structural tension of the gluten.
So what are we looking for?
Well, an immediate aggressive spring back indicates the gluten is still too tight and the internal gas pressure is too low. It basically means it needs more fermentation time.
But what if the indentation just stays there? Like
Yeah.
if there's zero structural recovery?
Then you've pushed the system to failure. It's overproof.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the yeast has produced a volume of carbon dioxide that completely exceeds the elasticity of the gluten network. The bonds have basically been stretched past their point of plastic deformation.
Meaning they're ruined.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
The moment that overproofed matrix hits the oven and goes through rapid thermal expansion, it lacks the structural integrity to hold its shape. It just collapses.
So you're really looking for a slow, partial recovery of that indentation. That confirms the gas volume and the network tension are perfectly balanced.
Exactly. It's a very specific rheological feedback.
Okay, but the structural rules completely flip when the manual shifts from bread to cakes and pastries, right?
Oh, 100%. It's a totally different game.
Because in bread, we spend immense energy developing that gluten matrix. But in pastry, the entire methodology is engineered to suppress it. Like, take the creaming method for butter cakes.
Right, where the standard is beating solid fat and crystalline sugar together for like 5 to 7 minutes until it's pale and fluffy.
We aren't developing protein there. We are mechanically forcing aeration to trap air.
It's basically a study in friction and geometry, because sucrose crystals have this jagged monoclinic structure. Very sharp. So when you apply kinetic energy driving those sharp crystalline structures through a semi-solid lipid-like butter, the sugar literally carves microscopic voids into the fat.
Wow, just carving out tiny caves.
Exactly, and those voids trap ambient air, creating a stable foam. So when the cake goes into the oven, the heat expands those specific air pockets, which gives you physical lift before the chemical leaveners even kick in.
Which perfectly explains why the temperature of the butter is so heavily scrutinized in the assessment. I mean, if the butter is too warm, it loses its plasticity.
Right. The sugar crystals just slice through liquid oil.
There's no friction, no air is trapped, and you end up with a dense brick of a cake.
Exactly.
But, okay, the restriction on mixing becomes even more severe with the muffin method. The mandate here in the manual is that the batter must remain highly textured and lumpy. Like, mixing is strictly capped at 10 to 15 strokes.
It's very strict.
But we are always conditioned to whisk until smooth. Leaving batter rough and lumpy feels entirely wrong.
I know, it goes against every instinct, right? But the science behind that restriction ties directly back to hydration and mechanical energy.
Because of the gluten again?
Yes. In a highly hydrated batter, the moment water hits the flour, glutenin and gliadin begin to bond. And because we want a tender crumb for a muffin, not a chewy piece of bread, we have to minimize the kinetic energy that aligns those bonds.
Oh, so stirring it too much ruins it.
Completely. Which challenges that instinct to whisk until perfectly smooth. A smooth muffin batter is actually a failed batter.
So those lumps aren't errors?
Not at all. They're basically dry hydration reservoirs.
Hmm.
They will slowly absorb ambient moisture and steam from within during the baking process, softening naturally without needing the friction that would trigger all that excessive gluten formation.
Okay, but what happens when you violate that limit? Because we need to look at the anatomy of a baking disaster.
Oh, the consequences are stark.
That-
Overmixing a quick bread batter aligns the proteins into this tense, rubbery network.
Right.
When that dense matrix goes into a high-temperature environment, the internal moisture converts to steam, and that steam generates significant vapor pressure and desperately seeks an escape route.
And because the overdeveloped gluten is too rigid to expand evenly,
The steam acts like a pneumatic drill.
it just fractures the crumb. The assessment manual refers to this specific failure as tunneling, right?
Yeah,
The steam basically forces geological-style fissures right through the pastry. It leaves these massive, irregular vertical channels from the core to the crust.
It's a purely mechanical failure caused by human error in the mixing phase. But, the manual also deeply analyzes thermal failures.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the manual treats a sunken cake center not as some baking mystery, but as a forensic crime scene.
A crime scene of temperature abuse?
Exactly. A cake that rises beautifully, but then caves in on itself, creating that distinct crater in the center. The assessment traces that collapse directly to an interruption of the thermodynamic sequence, specifically the starch gelatinization window.
Right, because baking isn't just cooking. It's an irreversible sequence of endothermic reactions.
And it's time chemistry.
Exactly. As the internal temperature of the batter climbs, the starch granules in the flour begin absorbing surrounding water. And between 93 and 99 degrees Celsius, those granules swell to their maximum capacity and burst, forming a rigid gel.
And simultaneously, the proteins from the eggs are unfolding and coagulating, right?
Yes, they link up with that starch gel to finalize the permanent architecture of the crumb.
It's such a delicate metamorphosis. So if a baker opens the oven door at like the midpoint of the bake, they flood the chamber with ambient cold air.
The temperature drops rapidly.
Right. And the internal vapor pressure of the expanding gases inside the cake decreases instantly. If that temperature drop happens before the internal temperature has crossed that critical 93-degree gelatinization threshold.
Cake architecture hasn't permanently set yet.
Exactly. The supporting gases contract, and the fragile, unset foam structure completely caves in under its own weight.
The structural integrity is just permanently compromised. You can't fix it.
And while a sunken cake is obviously an economic loss for a bakery, the manual treats thermal control in other areas as a matter of strict public health.
Which brings us to the HACCP protocol's hazard analysis and critical control points.
Right. The defining metric here is the danger zone. That's designated strictly as the thermal window between 5 degrees Celsius and 60 degrees Celsius.
Which, if you think about it, encompasses almost any normal room temperature environment.
Yeah, sitting on a counter is in the danger zone.
Exactly. And the focus isn't just that bacteria survive in this zone, but the sheer biomechanical velocity at which they replicate.
We're talking logarithmic growth phases here.
Yes. Biological contaminants, particularly pathogens like Salmonella or Staphylococcus, which you'd find in egg washes and dairy fillings, they undergo binary fission.
And in an optimal thermal environment within that danger zone, a single bacterial cell can divide every 20 minutes.
Every 20 minutes. So if a baker leaves a custard exposed for 3 hours, they aren't just facing slight spoilage, they're cultivating a massive, localized bacterial colony.
A biohazard.
Literally. And that colony is actively producing heat-stable enterotoxins.
Which is terrifying because those enterotoxins won't necessarily be destroyed even if the product is subsequently chilled or slightly reheated, right?
Exactly. It transforms a simple custard into a severe foodborne illness vector.
So to manage this relentless pressure, the narrow thermal windows, the delicate protein chemistry, the rigid safety limits, commercial bakers rely on an absolute, uncompromising mathematical system.
They don't rely on luck.
No, not at all. And the foundation of that system is the complete and total elimination of volume measurements, meaning no measuring cups.
Because volume is an inherently flawed metric for dry organic matter. I mean, if you measure flour with a standard volumetric cup, you are subjected to the bulk density variables of the ingredient.
Because flour is highly compressible.
Exactly.
Like a cup of flour that has been aerated or sifted might weigh 120 grams. But that exact same physical cup, if the flour has just settled in the bin or been packed tightly, can hold up to 160 grams.
And that 40-gram differential isn't just a slight margin of error.
No. It drastically skews the hydration ratio of the entire formula. The gluten yields differently, the thermal transfer during baking shifts, and the yeast activity is totally altered.
You just cannot build a reproducible chemical reaction on a variable metric. It's impossible.
So professional environments utilize gravimetric measurement, digital scales.
Right. Scales provide mass data down to the single gram, ensuring the hydration ratio remains mathematically constant regardless of the flour's aeration state.
Which introduces the core mathematical framework of the professional kitchen. Baker's percentage.
This is where it gets really mathematical.
Yeah. Instead of looking at a recipe as a static list of measured ingredients, Baker's percentage treats the formula as a structural ratio. And the unyielding rule of this framework is that the total weight of the flour is always designated as exactly 100%.
Always. Every other component in the matrix, the water, the butter, the salt, the yeast, is calculated as a strict percentage of that flour mass.
So if the formula requires 1,000 grams of flour and it operates at a 65% hydration rate, the baker immediately knows to scale 650 grams of water.
Exactly. And if the salt ratio is 2%, it dictates exactly 20 grams of salt.
So in the universe of a recipe, the flour is the North Star, or the sun. It is the absolute center of gravity, and every other ingredient just orbits around it based on its exact weight.
That's a great way to look at it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Baker's percentage allows a baker to zoom in or zoom out on a production yield instantly.
Without doing crazy fractions.
Right. If a hotel order demands expanding a 1-kilogram dough batch into a 200-kilogram industrial batch, you don't calculate complex conversions. The percentages remain universally fixed. The chemistry remains identical, whether you are mixing one single loaf or 1,000 loaves.
It guarantees perfect consistency.
Yeah.
But it's also the primary mechanism for financial survival, right?
Oh, absolutely. The TESDA manual outlines incredibly strict economic parameters. It notes that successful commercial bakeries must maintain their total food costs strictly between 25 and 35% of the retail selling price.
Because bakery profit margins are notoriously razor thin.
Exactly. When every ingredient is tracked by exact gram weight rather than arbitrary cups and spoons, the operational software can calculate the unit cost of a single croissant down to a fraction of a cent.
Wow.
Yeah. So if global commodities shift, say, the price of butter suddenly increases by 10%, the baker instantly sees how that fluctuation impacts that 35% food cost boundary.
So they can adjust the baker's percentage of the lipid slightly or recalculate the retail price to protect the margin.
The math literally dictates the survival of the business.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of disciplines. I mean, we've navigated the cellular biology of living yeast, the osmotic lethality of salt, the polymer physics of building gluten networks,
The thermodynamic windows of starch gelatinization.
and the rigorous, uncompromising economics of baker's math.
The assessment standard proves that baking at a professional level is really all about mastering variables. You are constantly controlling the environment to force very specific biological and chemical outcomes.
Yeah, so what does this all mean for you, the listener, the next time you bring a fresh loaf of bread into your kitchen? Well, I want to leave you with one final, mind-bending principle from the source material that challenges a deeply ingrained household habit.
Yeah, oh, this is a good one.
Right. When you cut into a loaf of bread, say 2 days later, and find it firm and crumbly, the natural instinct is to assume it is dried out, that the ambient air has somehow stolen its moisture.
But the reality is much more complex than that. Stalling is not primarily driven by evaporation. It is driven by a chemical process known as starch retrogradation.
Retrogradation.
Yeah, let's look back at that 93 to 99 degree gelatinization window in the oven, right? Where the amylose and amylopectin molecules in the starch swell up and set the structure.
They absorb the moisture and form that permanent rigid gel.
Yes, but that state is actually chemically unstable. As soon as the loaf comes out of the oven, drops below that thermal threshold and begins to cool, those gelatinized starch molecules start trying to return to their original ordered state.
They want to go back.
Right. They slowly reassociate and literally recrystallize into rigid structures.
Recrystallize.
That actual crystallization of the starch matrix is what makes the crumb feel hard and stale, even if the total moisture content of the loaf hasn't changed by a single drop.
That is wild. And because retrogradation is a crystalline phase change, it is highly sensitive to ambient temperature.
Extremely sensitive.
The chemical physics dictate that this crystallization process accelerates to its absolute maximum velocity at precisely 4 degrees Celsius.
Which, unfortunately for a lot of people, is the exact baseline temperature of a standard home refrigerator.
Yes. By placing your bread in the refrigerator in an attempt to, preserve its freshness, you are actually subjecting it to the optimal thermodynamic environment for staling.
Mm.
You're hyper-accelerating the starch retrogradation.
You're ruining your bread faster.
Literally. To maintain the soft texture of the crumb, the science offers only two viable paths. You can store it at room temperature, which keeps the thermal environment warm enough to significantly slow down that crystallization process.
Or, if you really need long-term storage, you must drop the temperature so aggressively that you bypass that 4-degree danger zone entirely.
Exactly. Placing the bread in the freezer drops the thermal energy so low that the retrogradation process is effectively paused. The water activity halts, and the crystallization simply cannot proceed.
It just freezes the process in time.
Yep. So next time you are holding a fresh pastry or a great loaf of bread and you're staring into the cold light of your open refrigerator, think about the thermodynamics of crystallizing starches. Step back, close the door, and just leave it on the counter.